Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of some of the recent nonfiction that I finished. First up, I have a collection of essays by 20 different writers called A Map is Only One Country. This was edited by Nicole, Chung, and Mensah Demary, and the 20 different writers in here write not just about immigration, although it does say 20 writers on immigration, family, and the meaning of home. Some of them are just about the immigration counter, essentially, getting your passport stamped places. I've seen a number of reviewers describe this as being about the American immigrant experience, and that is incorrect. Because while the majority of these 20 are pieces with the United States as an endpoint of an immigration story, at least 5 of them don't involve the United States at all. There is one story in here in which the writer is discussing her mother's immigration from Jamaica to Canada. There is another one in which the writer is discussing their parents' immigration from India to Australia. And one of the early pieces in this is a woman comparing the ease at which her husband, who has a British passport, can get a long-term stay visa for Thailand versus her with an Indian passport, where it's easy for her to get a 14-day stay, which is still more than some countries' passports would enable you to get a quick visa for. But it is quite a difference between having the UK passport and having the Indian passport. There's also a partition story in here in which someone's grandfather from Pakistan goes back to his village in India. So while this does have a very heavy US focus, as I said, I think 15 of the 20 are from US authors or US-based authors, that is not exclusively what this is. So if someone describes this as an immigrant American collection, no. It involves other countries as well. In any case, as with any collection that is multiple authors talking about multiple things, some of them worked better for me than others. There was one in here about, which is a Nigerian immigrant in the United States talking kind of negatively about his experience of cultural nuances, and especially around race and culture, that you miss out on when you haven't grown up in the United States, and how do you interpret that? And I noticed that a lot of reviewers felt very negatively towards that, but I thought that was fascinating because to a certain extent I had similar feelings when I lived in the US, but because of the way the racial nuances in the US work. So even though we were having the same experience of not necessarily getting all the social cues, it has a very different impact on somebody who walks into a room in the United States, is read as a black man versus is read as a white woman. So I thought that was very interesting, but a lot of people apparently were turned off by that. Anyway, as I said, as with anything, some were great, some were not. You go into a book with multiple authors with that expectation, I think. Next up, I have a book that I mentioned in a library haul a while ago, and that is Hearing Happiness, Deafness Cures in History by Jaipreet Virdi. This author is an assistant professor at the University of Delaware in a history department, and her academic work has involved a history of deafness, and this book is a collection of things that didn't appear in her academic work, but are essentially collected factoids that she felt were worth sharing. So as a book, this is a little bit more random than I think one might expect a book of this type to be, because it is just, here are some random things that people did to cure deafness, whether it was quackery, whether it was legitimate technology or not so legitimate technology. And it does go through the whole horn that you see on the cover through to cochlear implants, and the author is lowercase d deaf herself. She became deaf as a result of meningitis and was raised in the oralist style, and so her experience with the technology side of interacting with deafness essentially is different from someone who was, for example, born deaf from a deaf family who signs, especially in a US situation, because she is an American university, although she did grow up here in Toronto. So this is interesting in bits and pieces. It is one that you really don't need to read all the way through at once. You can dip in and out of this. I did read it pretty much all the way through because I had it at the library, but I think if you owned this, this is maybe one to go in and out of, especially if you are interested in this kind of history. And as you read side things about hearing aids or about quackery in various points in history, you might want to dip in and out of this. So it's interesting, but it's not particularly narrative driven, although she does insert some bits and pieces of her own experience throughout, which is interesting. I will say, if you're interested in histories of deafness or disability in general, you really should follow her on Twitter because she does some great history threads and they're well worth checking out. Speaking of academics writing about some of their fields of study. This is From Shamanism to Sufism, Women, Islam, and Culture in Central Asia by Razia Sultanova. The author of this is a ethnomusicologist who started doing research into female religious musical traditions in Uzbekistan when she was working in Russia in the late 1980s, so still during Soviet times when there was still official atheism for a couple of years there. And this is basically a summary of work that she did over the course of 20 years. Her primary focus is in Uzbekistan, although she does talk a little bit about Tajikistan and Kazakhstan somewhat. There's a chapter at the end where she talks about other Turkic cultures and how similar traditions didn't stay as clearly tied to the old shamanistic traditions, like in Tatar culture in Russia or in Turkey or Azerbaijan, etc. Just because in Uzbekistan, the nomadic lifestyle was maintained quite a bit longer than it was in some of these other cultures with similar histories, if you go back far enough. This was a great book to pick through. So as I said, the author, when she started this research, she was living in Russia. She is a research fellow at the University of Cambridge now, in the Faculty of Middle Eastern and Asian Studies. And this is quite a short book for the length of time that the research was taking place. Now she does, in the back, you can see how many academic papers were written in the meantime. This doesn't really go for a popular edge, so I don't know that I would recommend this as an introduction to Central Asian culture or to Sufism or to pre-Islamic Turkic shamanism. I wouldn't call this an introduction to any of those things. I would suggest reading an introduction to any of those areas and then picking this up afterwards if you are interested, because while she does have a glossary and explain some things, it does assume that you have a certain basis of this is who Tengri was, or whatnot. So this was really fascinating. She does mention a number of poets and singers that one could look up on the side, so I did spend a lot of time doing that. So I found this fascinating, but your interest in this region and this tradition may vary, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend this to everyone, but if you are interested, this is well worth reading, because it is quite fascinating. Alright, and now let's talk about some light reading. One thing that I picked up that is a perfect, I guess you could call this a bathroom read. Jenna from Bibliofilth did a video about books that her father kept in the bathroom. And this is exactly the kind of book one could keep in the bathroom. This is Football Clichés by Adam Hurrey. This is mostly a humorous look at, as it says, football cliches, as in the things that the presenters who call the matches would say. Getting in an early touch, gilt edges, navigating the modern football pitch. It is mostly humorous, although not really laugh out loud funny. It's more of a chuckle, and clearly something that you would pick up and read in bits and pieces. Honestly, I think having a nicer edition of this, if it existed, which sadly it does not, is something you could have on a coffee table and have as a conversation starter if you have people over to watch sporting events. I don't have much else to say about that, because either you think that's funny or you don't care because you hate soccer. So you wouldn't buy that if you hate soccer. But yeah. Another book that I don't have a lot to say about is Dot Journaling, a Practical Guide by Rachel Wilkerson Miller. I just had to say that name 5 times. I don't know why that was so hard for me to say. This is a detailing of dot journaling? Bullet journaling, I guess is what most people call it. It's cute. I am not that organized. I do have a day planner, and I am not going to show it to you because it is very sloppy. And not just because I have terrible handwriting, but because I'm very disorganized. But in my head, I like to imagine a version of me who is not so disorganized. And it's fun to imagine the journaling I would keep if I were more organized. And I think if you're looking for inspirational layouts, you would probably go and read somebody's blog on that, to be honest. But the book is fun. I saw Heidi from My Reading Life, I think, posted that particular one on Instagram, which is why I picked it up at the library. Yeah, I was entertained. And finally, I read a comic called Coffee Gives Me Superpowers. I'm filming on my phone, which is where I have the author's name. So, yeah, I'll have to insert that below. And I'll insert some images here, hopefully. It is essentially a series of facts about coffee, the top coffee producers, coffee importers, styles of coffee, and whatnot, illustrated in the style of, if you've read any of the oatmeal books, the running one, Your Cats Are Going to Kill You, those kind of things, it has that same style of art. This again is a book, as with the football cliches one, that I think would be more fun to have around as a conversation piece. It is something that somebody can flip through when they're bored. Reading it straight through was fine. Some of the facts are a little repetitive because they're presented in 2 different visual formats. It's cute, there's not much to it. I do love coffee, so Yeah, it was interesting, but as an ebook, I was left thinking, why? But if I had it as a physical book, it would be something, if I were organized enough to have a coffee stand somewhere, as I know some people do, you could put it there and your guests could look through it. But I don't have a coffee stand, and I read the ebook, so yeah, there wasn't much to it other than that, but as a conversation piece, I think it's cute. In any case, that is the most recent nonfiction that I read. Since it is Nonfiction November, you might be interested in some of these, depending on the one hand on things you are interested in hearing research about, or on the flip side, if you're looking for a discussion book about coffee or soccer. Yeah. In any case, if you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.